Welcome back, everyone. This demonstration is going to build directly on the previous one, in which we are now going to focus purely on IP addressing within a virtual network. In this demonstration, we are going to pick up where we left off, in which we created our initial virtual network in a subnet, and now we're going to go ahead and create IP addresses and assign them to different resources. Specifically, we're going to go ahead and create a public static IP address. During the process, we'll go ahead and select the IP SKU that we want to use. We will then go ahead and create a simple virtual machine and assign that pre-created IP address to that virtual machine. And finally, after we assign that IP version 4 address, we're going to go back to that virtual machine, or to be more accurate, the network interface card, and we're going to update the network interface configuration to also assign an IP version 6 address to that same machine or network interface as well. Let's now go ahead and jump over to the Azure portal and get started. Okay, we are back in our Azure portal environment using another Playgrounds environment, and we are once again picking up where we left off in the previous demo, in which we have a sample virtual network created with a subnet attached to it, which also has an IP version 6 address space and subnet as well. It currently does not have anything hosted inside of it, nor any IP addresses. Let's go ahead and fix that now. The first thing we're going to do is we are going to pre-create a static IP address in advance. Now keep in mind, you are not required to pre-create your IP address to create a virtual machine. In fact, when creating a virtual machine, you can create your IP address on the spot. However, for demonstration's sake, especially because we want to view the relationship between different configuration options, we're going to go ahead and configure our IP address separately. To do so, the easiest way to do it, at least in my opinion, is to go to our search field up top, type in IP address, and we have public IP addresses right here. I'm going to go ahead and click to create a public IP address. And on this next screen, we're going to actually spend a little bit of time looking at all the different configuration options available, and especially noting which options are available or not available depending on what SKU or other configurations you pick. Before I do so, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in just a little bit. Notice that we have our configurations that we talked about in the previous conceptual lesson. We have our IP version of IP version 4, 6, or both. We can actually create both addresses at once. We have our SKU of the standard or basic tier. We have another tier here of regional or a global IP address. This is more used for cross-region load balancers, so we're not really focused on this for now. Also, a little bit further down, we have our IP address assignment of dynamic or static. Notice that it is grayed out at the moment, and static is our only option. And we also have a granular routing preference of routing our IP address as much as possible over the private Microsoft network or the public internet. And of course, we have the usual names of naming our IP address, choosing a resource group, etc., and we'll get to those here in just a second. What I want to focus on at the moment is noticing that when we change some configuration options, other ones either become grayed out or unavailable based on those previous changes. First off, notice that if we have the standard SKU selected, we cannot choose between a dynamic or static IP address assignment because we noted earlier that standard SKUs are static only. However, if we choose basic, that toggle now becomes available, and we can choose between either a dynamic or a static IP address assignment. Also notice if we go back to our standard SKU, the routing preference is available of choosing to either route over the Microsoft network backbone or the public internet. However, if we go back again to the basic SKU, that routing preference is gone, which routes by default over the public internet, and we cannot choose the Microsoft backbone if we want to. Also notice if we choose the basic SKU, the ability to choose a global or regional tier also becomes grayed out, only letting us assign a regional address. If we want to look at one more toggle or configuration, if we go back to standard SKU, and we have our tiers and routing preference available, if we go to IP version 4 to IP version 6, the tier option is not available anymore, which means IP version 6 address are regional only, and you cannot create a global IP version 6 address for the scenarios of cross-region load balancers, which are IP version 4 only. Also interesting to note that with IP version 6 enabled, if we choose the basic SKU, our IP address assignment is forced as dynamic, and even though we're using basic, since we have IP version 6, we are forced to use a dynamic IP address assignment, and we cannot create an IP version 6 address using the basic SKU as static. So just another interesting interaction there. For this example, I'm going to go ahead and go back to IP version 4. We're going to go ahead and choose a standard SKU, and we're going to go ahead and leave it as static, which of course we have no other choice. To finish this step out, let's go ahead and give our IP address a name. Let's just call it my IP, just for something simple. And we'll do the other required options, such as resource group. And then our final check is to make sure that the region matches our virtual network, which I happen to know is in the central US region. If you created an IP address in a region other than your virtual network, you would not be able to assign it to your VNet resources because, like virtual networks, IP addresses are region bound unless you choose the global tier in the case of cross-region load balancers. Everything else is good. We'll go ahead and click on Create. Okay, and that will complete here in just a second. I'll go ahead and pause and come back when it's done. It will be about 10 or 20 seconds. Okay, looks like our deployment completed successfully. I'll go ahead and click on Refresh. We'll do a hard refresh. And we have our IP address assigned to Central US. Very good. At this point, we're now ready to move on to creating our virtual machine and assigning our newly created IP address to that machine. Let's go ahead and do that now. We'll go to our search field up top. Type in virtual machines. We'll go ahead and create a new one. And for this machine, we're going to leave most of the options as default, except for some of our networking options. On our basic screen, we need to go ahead and choose our resource group. Give it a name. We'll go with My VM for now. And all the other options on this screen are fine. What we are going to pay attention to is our networking screen. From our networking options, we can choose a virtual network. We have the one we created in advance called My VNet. We could also create a new VNet if we wanted to with our subnet. And we also need to choose a public IP address. Notice that it defaults to creating a new one on the spot, as shown by the new in parentheses. In this case, we're going to go ahead and hit the drop-down menu, choose the one we created a moment ago called My IP, and then we'll assign that pre-created IP address to our virtual machine. The rest of our options should be fine as is. Let's go ahead and click on Review plus Create. And then after validating it, we'll go ahead and click on Create. After we hit Create, since we chose to create a Linux machine, we'll be prompted to download the SSH key pair. We'll go ahead and do that. We're not going to connect to it. This is just so we can actually go ahead and create our machine. This is going to take about a moment or so to complete. I'm going to go ahead and pause this video and come back when it's done. Okay, after just a moment, our virtual machine is up and running. I'm going to go ahead and click on Go to Resource. And from here, I can view information about our IP address. From the right side of our My VM overview, we have our public IP address here. If I click on that, that takes us to the configuration of the My IP address I created just a moment ago, showing that this IP address is associated with our virtual machine. We can also confirm that by going back to the public IP addresses option. And if we click on My IP, we can see from the right side that it's currently associated with My VM 93, which is actually the network interface which is associated with our virtual machine. And we can confirm that by clicking it. That takes us to My VM 93, which is attached to My VM. Again, remember, an IP address is assigned to a network interface, which is then assigned to a virtual machine to effectively give that virtual machine its IP address. Very good. Last thing I want to do before we close this demonstration out is to update our existing network interface, which we're already in for My VM 93, and I want to update it to add an IP version 6 address to that network interface as well. Now keep in mind, if we did not already have an IP version 6 subnet, we would not be able to attach an IP version 6 address. However, since we do have that subnet, we can go ahead and do so. To add an IP version 6 address to an existing network interface, we'll go to our IP configurations menu on the left side. From here, we have our primary IP configuration of the My IP address assigned to it. To go ahead and add a new IP address, we'll go ahead and click on our Add button here. We'll go ahead and give this configuration a name called My IPv6. Not surprisingly, we need to choose IPv6 for the IP version. Also notice we can only assign it as a secondary address because we have a primary one already in place. Final two settings are the private and public IP address settings. We can choose to create a static private address in IPv6 format, We're going to go ahead and leave it as dynamic for now. However, if we had one in mind, we would choose static and put in our entire IP version 6 string here. And we also have the option of optionally assigning it a public IP address as well. Remember, a private IP address is required, a public one is optional. I'm going to go ahead and choose to associate it with a public IP address. If we had one already pre-created, we could go ahead and choose one. However, we did not pre-create any IP version 6 public addresses, so we'll go ahead and click on Create New, and we'll go ahead and give it a name of Public IPv6. Hit OK. Click on OK. This is going to take about a moment or so again. I will pause and come back when it's done. Okay, and after a brief moment, our new IP configuration is complete, and we can see we now have 2 IP configurations added to our virtual machine, or to be more specific, the virtual machine's network interface of my-VM93. We have the IP version 4 configuration, which has the My IP address we pre-created in advance associated with it. And we also have an IP version 6 address with both a private IP version 6 address and a public IP version 6 address as well. With that in mind, it's going to go ahead and conclude our demonstration of working with IP address with virtual networks. To review, we created an IP address in advance, focusing on the relationship between different configurations, whether it was different IP SKUs, whether we could use a dynamic or static address, and we also noticed that the routing options change with different SKUs as well. We then created a virtual machine, which automatically created a network interface from which we were able to associate with our pre-created IP address. And then once our virtual machine was created, we were then able to update the configuration of the network interface to add an IP version 6 address to that same network interface as well. That wraps up our demonstration. Let's move on to the next lesson.